Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for the first in this semester's series of TGI FHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute's Friday morning series. TGI FHI gives Duke faculty in the humanities, interpretive social sciences, and the arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, and allows you, the audience, to get to know the humanities, arts, and interpretive social sciences faculty at Duke University. There is no agenda or theme indicated in the series, no demand to be disciplinary or interdisciplinary, just to present the work that faculty are doing at the moment that most excites them. While I regret that we cannot meet over breakfast this morning in Smith Warehouse at Duke, our usual location for TGI FHI, I am delighted that we are able to include in this format colleagues and interested publics from near and far. On the website of the Franklin Humanities Institute, you can find recordings of past TGI FHI's future TGI FHI plans for this semester, and also an interview with Laura in which she describes her work. It's very nice to see among the attendees, you can't see each other, so let me say this to you, so many colleagues from all over the place, but also specifically from Duke, from classics, from religion, from German. It's really a pleasure to have you here. So I'm very, very pleased to introduce Professor Laura Lieber, who is Professor of Religious Studies, Classical Studies, German Studies, and Divinity, and Director of the Duke Center for Jewish Studies. Her research focuses on liturgical poetry from late antiquity, including poetry of the Synagogue, the Byzantine Church, and the Samaritan community. Her approach to these works, she tells us, draws not only on the conventional modes of analysis, including history of biblical interpretation, source and form criticism, but also on ritual and performance studies, is informed by insights from the study of visual and material culture and archaeology. Professor Lieber's numerous publications include the books Yanai on Genesis, an invitation to Piyut from 2010, The Vocabulary of Desire, the Song of Songs in the Early Synagogue from 2014, Jewish Aramaic Poetry from Late Antiquity, Translations and Commentary from 2018, and the forthcoming Classical Samaritan Poetry in Context, which is due to appear this year in 2021. She's currently at work on her fifth book, Staging the Sacred, Performance in Late Ancient Liturgical Poetry, which is under contract from Oxford University Press. A reviewer of Yanai on Genesis, Deborah Blank, praises the book, writing, "Once in a while, not often enough, a book comes out that represents a tectonic shift in its field as well as others. This volume is such a book, and after 6 months of perusing it," she says, "I remain impressed by the author's erudition, creativity, and contribution, not only to Piyut studies, but also to Jewish, Hebrew, and Byzantine studies in general." End quote. Laura focuses on poetic interventions, understanding these in the context of cultures of exegesis. She has a deep commitment to contextualization and the practices and performance of worship. Her second book examines how liturgical poets use the available words of the biblical Song of Songs as lexemes to construct richly woven liturgical poetry. And her translation and commentaries in her third book are of Jewish Aramaic poetry, Aramaic literature, the poetry written during the Byzantine era, roughly until the middle of the 7th century, in the dialect known as Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. The combination of contextualization and the use of performance theory, coupled with, by all accounts, I can't actually, claim to know this myself, but by all accounts, exacting translation, create a vivid understanding of the content and the function of the poetic in her work. A recent article, for example, by Laura from 2017, Scripture Personified, Torah as Character in the Hymns of Marka, She writes of 4 liturgical poems by Marker, and in the process explains how Samaritans and Jews in late antiquity dramatized their sacred canon, personified it, and composed lyrics to express their devotion to it. Through this idea of personification, she shows how in both traditions, scripture was understood as possessing properties of agency. It was not merely a document symbolizing the covenant between God and Israel, she writes, but God's primary creation, possessing the ability to act, mediate, and engage both deity and people. Scripture became a character, she writes, in the ongoing story of God and God's people. Neither Samaritan nor Jewish traditions developed a logos theology in which divine word becomes divine person incarnate, as in the case in Christianity. But in writings from both communities, we see the divine word personified both conceptually and performatively. This rich article shows a distinction between Marker's prose and poetry, in which she writes he attends, quote, less to history and philosophy and more to drama and the frisson of myth. End quote. A distinct form of ritual is thus presented. The poem, she writes, creates and conveys this understanding and provides a dramatic, unique understanding, not only of the act of revelation, but its very nature, a nature that colors and is colored by the ritual context in which these poems came to life, end quote. Professor Lieber's deeply contextual work gives us a vivid sense of the life of the poetic as adjectival and the ways in which it informs the whole question of the ritual. Her TGI FHI talk presents material from her fifth book that is almost finished, Staging the Sacred Performance in Late Ancient Liturgical Poetry. Okay, over to you, Laura. Thank you so much for joining us.
So, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to so many people for coming. I always say that all of my affiliations and all of my publications are due to the fact that I'm a middle child and I need attention desperately. So I think perhaps that's why I find the study of drama and performance so appealing. I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint, which in part is for sharing text and in part for sharing images, because part of my contextual project is looking at the built environment and the visual environment, but also teasing those non-literary sources, teasing out from them some of the intangibles from late antiquity, including, what imagining, sort of much of my enterprise is imaginative, but the idea of delivery and how sort of the experience of hearing these texts performed in the synagogue, what that would have been like. And much of my project is premised on the fact that the Jewish community in antiquity, primarily in the Galilee, but also in the diaspora, was embedded in a wider culture, and that these cultures were all dynamically engaged with each other. Sometimes there was friction, sometimes there was exchange, and sometimes there were just sort of more ineffable ideas of sort of what it meant to be entertaining and what was sort of constituted effective communication. But I take these works very seriously as works that were performed and received and popular in their period. So if you have any questions about any of the images that go by, I'm happy to talk about those as well. Mostly I've chosen images that highlight aspects of what I'm speaking about in some either direct or oblique way. So this is the center Helios mosaic from the synagogue in Hamat Tiberias from the 4th century. And I think it's the way it represents the integration of Judaism and sort of Greco-Roman visuals. And first I want to just give a little bit of background on the texts I study. They're called PUTeam. So I'm going to first very briefly present a little bit on the texts themselves that I'm going to be talking about today. And then I will talk more at length about how I read them in this late antique context, which I always think was sort of coloring in from the margins, from what we do know to what we can't know, and trying to sort of like just keep shading in further towards that center. And then I'll look specifically at one case study, which is the idea of acclamation, and how that may help explain where these poems actually came from, how they emerged, and how they were experienced. So here I have a mosaic of David as Orpheus from the Gaza Synagogue. So again, that synthesis of Jewish culture and Hellenistic culture. So some background. I have here, I'm just going to briefly talk about, there are three sort of major genres of synagogue literature. The first is Targum, which is the Aramaic translations of scripture, originally performed live in the synagogue. So the scroll would be read from in Hebrew, a certain number of verses, and then the verses would be translated into the vernacular. Many of the Aramaic poems that I look at were originally preserved in these Targum manuscripts, although that appears to be later, that they were originally sort of a separate thing, but because of their association with the translation, their dialect of Aramaic, and sort of later under sort of literary understandings of both the Targum and these poems, they were sort of put together. Midrash are the prose homilies explicating scripture that often embed a lot of folklore and legend. They were presumably originally in some sense oral. They circulated, James Kugel likes to say it's sort of like jokes, but except for they can be very serious, obviously. But they're sort of these homilies and analyses of the biblical text. They're often related in some way to other forms of rabbinic prose literature. And you may have be familiar with these in terms of when someone says, like, the rabbis say. When the rabbis say something, it's usually something taken from Midrash or perhaps one of these other Aggadic sources. And Midrash is sort of the favored first child in my field. It gets the most attention, Midrash and Talmud. And finally, there's the texts that I work in, which are the piyutim, piyut. They're liturgical poems. They're written in Hebrew and in Aramaic. And they weave interpretations of the biblical text, which is the week's lectionary or the festival readings or other relevant sort of liturgical texts. And they weave them into statutory prayers or ritual performance in the synagogue setting. And I would note that one thing that's worth paying attention to is the fact that piyut, it's from the same root that gives us the English word poet and poetry. It's a sort of Greek loan word, which to me has always signified the fact that the rabbis, because this word first appears in late antiquity, recognize these poems as being something different from biblical texts or poetry written in the style of biblical texts. They were something new, so they got this new kind of name from a new language, rather than using a biblical word like shir or tehillah. Most of the poems I work on come from the Cairo Geniza. A Geniza is a storehouse where people store sacred manuscripts, or in this case, manuscripts written in Hebrew characters, which might be sacred. There was not a great deal of editorial scrutiny before things were put in this storehouse. Prior to proper disposal, the Geniza in Cairo simply never got to that stage of burying and properly disposing of the documents that had been stored there. There are over 300,000 documents, and they span a millennium from around 870 to the 1880s. And so you have some of the stats here. So from spanning really sort of the known world of the Jewish community during that period. So from Kiev to France to India. And really, because Cairo was a crossroads and people would often winter there, there were many, the breadth of Jewish culture that's represented there is significant. Shlomo Goitein, a great scholar of the Geniza from the 20th century, referred to it as the living sea scrolls. And what's significant is that roughly 40% of the texts are poetry. And one of the most important things from my perspective is sort of the fact that this helped sort of rebalance some of our understanding of the importance of poetry, including liturgical poetry, in the lives of regular Jews in this pre-modern and even early modern period. I focus primarily on the early material. And so as Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole note in their wonderful study on the Cairo Geniza about the fact that this is not just important sort of sacred texts as we would recognize them, but sort of the wealth of a middle-class Jewish community's detritus. So wills and marriage contracts, bills of lading, writs of divorce, prayers, prescriptions, trousseau inventories, amulets, shop inventories, responsa, contract, magic charms, and receipts. Really, any text that sort of touched on life, whether a holy text or just a daily life, could end up there. And this is the image from the cover of the book. It's a famous picture of Solomon Schechter, who sort of generally credited sort of recognizing the treasures that were in the Cairo Geniza, sort of dealing with the manuscripts, which had never been stored in a way that was sort of had with an eye towards scholars ever wanting to look at them again. They were really on their way to being buried and disposed of, but they were rescued. There are many figures involved beyond Solomon Schechter, and the whole recovery of the Geniza would be a separate talk. But I do love this picture of him because I think many of us, especially as we work from home at our dining tables, may feel sort of like this is how we live. And just to give you a picture, you have here, there's an image of sort of like what the text looked like when they would sort of be first encountered. They're sort of all heaped together and texts from different eras and periods and provenances. But at the same time, you also have on the other side, you can see sort of a beautifully laid out manuscript of the poet on whom I wrote my first book, Yanai, and how beautifully it's laid out. And you can really see, even just visually, the patterning. You can see that it's poetry, that it's really laid out. And in fact, there are cues there. You can see how the short form that it's written out, indicating that there are refrains and other sort of formally patterned features, that they're patterned enough that they don't have to keep writing the same word over and over again. They could just write little cues to the reader to repeat certain words and phrases. And so this recognition of sort of the patterning is something that I'm going to be talking about a lot later in the talk. So with that bit of background, which I realize is fairly fast, I'm going to now look at some of the what I call sort of foreground, the world in which the Piyutim took shape. And here, to complement David from the Gaza Synagogue, here I have David, sort of an Orphic figure from a Christian tomb, Syriac writing there from Edessa, so 3rd century. So just the continuity of sort of a visual programs. So as I said, we're sort of coloring in from the margins, and my questions here are really looking at these texts as performance texts, not simply fitting them into sort of a history of Jewish liturgical poetry, not which was sort of, it's an important and actually ongoing first stage, sort of simply compiling the texts and creating texts that can actually be worked with as texts and not just sort of scraps of fragmentary poems. So there's that sort of basic work of assembling the texts, and then sort of the next stage in some ways was sort of accounting for how these works fit into the history of sort of Jewish literature more broadly, how they seem to relate to the rabbinic literature that was emerging at the same time. Because I'm really looking at the 4th through 7th centuries of the Common Era, and this is the same period when a number of very important rabbinic works, prose works, are being anthologized and edited and compiled and sort of taking their familiar fixed form. But I'm also looking at these liturgical poems. I'm interested in them as Jewish texts, so they're Jewish liturgical poems. So I'm interested in them as Jewish texts, but also as liturgical texts, which it takes me into the realm of ritual studies and seeing them in the synagogue context specifically, and then also as poetry, as literature in their own right. And so because they arose in this period of late antiquity, I really want to read these works in the context of late antique literature. And as I mentioned, they're called piyutim, in a word which indicates sort of a recognition that they are somehow a new form of poetry, perhaps even a sort of a Hellenized or Hellenistic sort of form of poetry. They get this Greek name, but they're certainly innovative. And there's a question we'll see both among Jews and non-Jewish writers about where sort of hymnody in this period came from, because it's the same period that we see our earliest Hebrew and Aramaic liturgical poetry. We also see liturgical poetry arising in the Syriac speaking world, and then eventually when Jewish poetry in the 6th century is sort of at the peak of its classical period. It's the same time that we have Romanos writing in Greek poetry in Constantinople. So in a way, sort of throughout the ancient world, late antique world, there was this whole sort of revolution, this literary revolution, which was very much a liturgical revolution of these poems. And we also see it in Samaritan poetry, which is easily overlooked because it was a much smaller community, but it's been a fascinating third body of literature for me to consider. So what I'm really interested in is seeing how all of these kinds of poetry function in this sort of matrix of late antique culture and performance. And so that's why I refer to them sort of as new hymnody. And what's proven very helpful for me is to look at them alongside other forms of performance from their time period, specifically actors and orators. And I would say that sort of actors, orators, and liturgical poets, whether Jewish, Christian, or Samaritan, seem to share sort of a certain body of techniques, which are not unique to them by any stretch. We can see them in a number of bodies of writing, but they're being thought through by writers in late antiquity, such as speech and character, ethopoeia, ekphrasis, these and sort of visual vividness and appeals to the senses, attention to body language and gestures. And they all relate to some idea of a shared canon, sort of bodies of traditions that you can assume that your listeners are aware of and you can allude to effectively without rehearsing entire stories. So shared traditions, plots, texts, and figures. And in some way, they're also all seeking to persuade the listeners. These are not sort of just data-driven texts. They are engaging audiences. So whether the actor wants the audience to feel a certain way, or a lawyer wants the populace to sort of like see an event his client's way, or in the case of liturgical poets, that in some way they understand reality the way that the liturgical poet is sort of crafting the experience in the synagogue. And that all of these rely on sort of both a mixture of formal and informal education, although that's a very complicated idea to unpack. I'm not talking about sort of schools and literacy necessarily, but there are many sort of informal modes of education. And even very well-educated homilists like Augustine and Chrysostom refer to their congregations as getting most of their education about classical antiquity from the theater and other things. But we all pick up things informally as well as formally, although here I have an ossuary that has a depiction of a school setting, which I quite like. I love school. So one of the things I look at in my study, which I won't be going into here, is I'm very interested in this vocabulary of gesture, sort of the body language, and which I think we still is quite significant, but there were specific gestures that were understood by both actors and orators to indicate sort of like certain moods and actions and to generate certain responses. So I have here the tombstone of the female mime, Basila, and she's making sort of that interesting little gesture in her above her epitaph. There's Augustus making sort of gesturing to the troops, which actually looks quite a bit like called the same sort of ad locutio gesture that Martin Luther King Jr. is making in Washington. Then we have a comb with it was apparently a prize. It's inscribed for Halladia and the Blues, which to me sounds like it could be a musical group, but actually the Blues was a chariot faction. And so it was part of some kind of contest, and this female mime presumably was either a winner or was associated with the winners. And then finally, I have Amanda Gorman, I think, and I found one of the things she was visually striking at the inauguration as well as verbally striking. I think that she was a wonderful sort of recent reminder of the importance of delivery on a poem in the context of poetry. I'm also very interested in performance spaces. I've been doing a lot of reading, again, on sort of acoustics and the fact that we know in the 6th century in particular that sort of various synagogues and churches were sort of updated in ways that actually improved their acoustics and may have also changed sight lines and other things. And I just note here that Epiphanius makes this rather enigmatic statement. Scholars, I want to be honest, are sort of not entirely sure exactly what he had in mind, but he's talking about a prayer place at Shechem, which would be a Samaritan synagogue, now called Neapolis, about 2 miles out of town on the plain, that was set up theater fashion outdoors in the open air by the Samaritans, who mimic all the customs of the Jews. So here we have sort of a early Christian writer associating Samaritans and Jews worship with the theater. It's unnatural for me not to pause for questions, but I will keep going. So I want to look as a specific thing, rather than looking at gestures or spaces or speech and character or ekphrasis or other things that I treat in my book. I thought for today I would look at acclamation, which is, as we know here, sort of Brent Shaw writing about there's a passage about the Arian heretics and Ambrose, but public chanting as sort of a locus of political discourse in this case. What's important to me is the idea that, first of all, the idea that people were well versed in their own culture. Just because something may strike us as unusual doesn't mean that it would have been strange for them. And the fact that people already knew what to do, that people were accustomed to being the sort of participatory element in public speech. So as he notes, the bishop as preacher was one voice of the divine, but the powerful collective enunciations of the people counted in the same way. And so, and here sort of this idea, I just have sort of, there are various places where you see sort of like, in a way, sort of dialogues between different figures and communications between forms of, regal figures and the population, which often there is a sort of sense of power in numbers. So this idea of acclamation, of sort of the community voice as having a role in public speech, is not anything that sort of would have been alien to Jewish writers in antiquity, because we have a number of biblical sources where that's very clearly the dynamic. God speaks to the Israelites in the book of Exodus, and all the people answered with one voice, all the words which the Eternal has spoken, we will do. Similarly, the king speaks and the people shout, long live the king. So there's a great deal of connection between sort of enthronement rituals and sort of the power structures and the acclamation of people assenting to that, which I would actually note that this diptych is of the installation, the accession of a consul in the 6th century. So we also have just verbal, sort of what we would recognize as kind of refrains. So such as in Psalm 136, the phrase, Ki leolam chasto, for his fidelity endures forever, occurs at the end of every verse. So there are 26 verses and that phrase occurs 26 times. We also have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, so looking at the post-biblical period, the Hellenistic period, early centuries before the Common Era, we have famously Psalm 145 has a refrain added to it. So the biblical text does not have a refrain, but in this scroll from Qumran, it is given a refrain. Which indicates, I would say, something part of its performance. So here we have Ambrose, so from representing the Church Fathers, talking about the importance of psalm performance as uniting. So, and again, sort of looking at not just the text of the Psalms, the experience of experience of the Psalms in a liturgical context. That it unites those at odds and reconciles those who have suffered offense, and the importance of singing to God with a single voice. Certainly, it is a great bond of unity for the whole body of the people to come together in one chorus. The strings of the kithara are all different, but they bring about harmony. So, a little picture of a woman with a kithara. But a recognition, sort of, that the experience of singing together is transformative in some way. That's a ritually, it's a word, it's, as in the words of Austin, it's a words doing things. It's also important to realize that this sort of acclamation would have been a routine part of daily life. So we have, as Lieber writes, the acclamations formed a continuous accompaniment of public life. So we know that they were part of sort of shouting at weddings. We might shout Mazel Tov. And then, and again, if you think, I think sort of like you look at sports and protests and other places, this continues today. There are certain places where we are not surprised when chants of various kinds erupt. And we, for all the fact that we may never have been to a protest before, or been to certain kinds of sporting events, we somehow sort of like know what to do or we learn on the fly. This is a deeply sort of social human skill, I would say. Pliny describes parents teaching certain formula to their children. We have it in the New Testament. Again, we have like the hymns associated with Arians, taking them into the street, and Ambrose and Chrysostom. I refer to these as psalm slams, where they sort of like, I picture sort of contesting flows of Christians meeting in the street and singing at each other. And in the same way, we also have evidence of Jews as being present in this late antique culture. I think the material evidence of Jews is sort of lesser, and the sources we have skew heavily towards the non-Jewish, but we do increasingly have recognized sort of the presence of Jews in this context. So I would sort of say acclamation was everywhere, and so were the Jews. So it's not unnatural or a stretch of the imagination to imagine Jews participating in this kind of public life. So here I just have some sort of scenes of acclamation from Trajan's column. And again, the body language to me is very interesting, sort of the way that they are engaging with each other, while at the same time you can see that the speaker is elevated and the people are more they're smaller but more massed. So, and here are just some images actually from domestic, so from houses in, some are in Spain here and some are in Syria, but sort of giving you a sweep of the Mediterranean world, which is part of my agenda, that this was sort of very widespread, but of images of theater and spectacles and performance in people's houses. So I think in the way that we may have like movie posters and Broadway posters and pictures of stars in our dorm rooms and houses, that and certainly people now have like cutouts of their favorite football players, who knows, that idea of bringing sort of the famous spectacles into your house is we see it in antiquity as well. And certainly the pictures of the quadriga, the chariot, resembles the zodiac mosaics that we see in synagogues and calendrical mosaics that we see in churches as well. So there are common visual elements, and we also have a lot of evidence that the same artists were often sort of employed in different locations. So an artist might work in a house for one project and then turn around and do a church or a synagogue. So for acclamation, I hear a couple of, that there are a number of different terms, and as Charlotte Rouchet notes, and here just to quote her, for this reason, the diversity of the number of terms which could be used for acclamation, the occasions on which acclamations are used have not always been recognized or understood. And this is an important note for me, because one of the things I'm arguing ultimately is that some of the participatory elements of liturgical poems are not precisely acclamation. They're serving sort of something of a different function, but that they make sense in the context of late antiquity because people would simply be accustomed to that kind of dynamic of having their voices, of having a speaking role in the drama in which that they are also spectators. So I would say sort of that the key elements that I highlight are that these are public, that there's an emphasis on unity and speaking at volume, and that there is an assumption that there is a powerful audience. Only in liturgical text, the audience is the deity, or possibly angelic hosts. So that these acclamations transform brief vocalizations that would otherwise be monologues into a very specific kind of effective speech. So, and here I quote Aldrete, through the medium of acclamation, the emperor and the urban plebs engaged in continuous process of negotiation by which they constantly defined and renewed their relationship to one another and their place in society. I think in the liturgical setting, it's the deity and the human community defining their relationship to each other and their place in history. So here I have another zodiac mosaic from the synagogue at Sepphoris. And so looking specifically at acclamation and hymnody, I had to include here this charming picture from the Church of St. George, where I'm pretty confident in context that it is it's a figure making a gesture of prayer, but to me, thanks to rabbinical school, it looks like he's saying, please rise. And so, but it is just the body language of prayer is an important element in my work. So I have here the idea of verbal formulations serving these different functions. And in particular, I want to sort of just briefly go through a few ways of seeing in the poems this idea that's sort of analogous to acclamation. And we have fixed word patterns, antiphony, we have speaking in character, and then we also have some more subtle elements like body language that I look at. So the fixed word pattern, and here I'm taking all of my examples from the Jewish Palestinian Aramaic poetry because it's concise, and also because in some ways we know a little bit less about where they come from and how they were used. It is just one body of the literature that I study in my work overall. I actually make a real effort in my current project to look at Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Syriac work, and to sort of constantly sort of show how, for all the very significant and very real differences among these religious communities and the differences between being alive in the 4th century and being alive in the 6th century, that there were these sort of commonalities in terms of performance norms. But I'm looking at the Jewish Aramaic poetry for this presentation. And so I would say sort of the simplest ones are certain poems where every stanza opens or closes with a single word. And you can imagine, I think, if you're in a public setting, how you would easily pick up on these sorts of patterns. So whether it's a lament where every stanza begins with the word alas, that starts to set a certain mood. You know, I sort of say the first 1 or 2 times you say something, it might just sort of feel like a word. By the time you said alas 22 times, you are starting to really feel the mood. Same sort of process, but a very different effect when you're shouting out happily, presumably, at the wedding, "O groom." So we have, and then the structures get more complicated. In some, we have like in one poem, that's another lament for the 9th of Av, which commemorates the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. The final words of the stanzas alternate Zion and Yerushalayim. So you can almost imagine actually antiphonal sort of choruses. So there's sort of, they're different. We can imagine sort of performances being more or less elaborate, or people simply understanding sort of the alternation. In some cases, the repetitions clarify who's speaking. So we have one poem where it alternates, says Moses, say the angels, telling us in what voice we should hear certain lines spoken. Similarly, the same pattern, Moses says to the angels and the angels say to Moses the prophet. That's sort of helping us understand how sort of the character that's being spoken, which is very different from, there are a number of poems that I look at actually where I was intrigued by the fact that the speaker, that you have to know who's speaking to understand how the words are being spoken. There's sometimes where the speaker is unmarked and only delivery would tell us who is speaking. And then they get sort of their other forms. Here the different lines, each end in sort of a pattern. The eternal is king, the eternal reigns, the eternal will reign, and may his great in his great house may he reign forever and ever. And then the last one, which is sort of, King Nebuchadnezzar is referred to as the dwarf due to a Gothic tradition that clearly the author of this poem, everyone was supposed to understand that the dwarf referred to King Nebuchadnezzar. And then we have Daniel's friends arguing with him. But again, the sort of like specification of who is speaking. There are other sort of even more intricate formulas where, again, it may be that people participated in the recitation, but another case I think is sort of where you could count on them to pick up on the patterns. So there's a eulogy poem where at the funeral, we might say Adam died, who does not die? Moses died, who does not die? So it sort of goes through David died, who does not die? So it's sort of, really driving home sort of the Stoic idea of mortality. And then in other cases, there's a poem for Purim, which is all about the wife of Haman. Woe for her for what befell her on the account of her son, Parshandata, for example. So it goes through all the 10 sons of Haman, and the son's name drives the rhyme scheme of the entire stanza. So these are to get more intricate structures. And here sort of I say the interplay of tradition and innovation, because these poems only make sense if the community sort of knows the traditions that they're playing on in terms of biblical texts and traditions or rabbinic texts and traditions. But at the same time, sort of the reception and performance of them requires a certain amount of literacy in terms of the performative culture of the period. And so, as I say here, leveraging the canon, we also see biblical verses and phrases used as refrains. So, for example, a lament for Tisha B'Av, for the 9th of Av, the destruction of the temple, where each strophe ends with my eye flows with tears. Or these sort of scaffolding poems where there's a wedding poem where every strophe ends in a quotation from Psalm 145 in order. So it works through this. Again, Psalm 145 is the one that in the Qumran text received a refrain. It is the song that my 10-year-old sang at his big brother's bar mitzvah. It's a very popular text. And so you could, again, count on people to know the text. And there's sort of this pleasure, I think, that arises from realizing, that there are new words preceding the words that you know, and you sort of are catching on in a way. So at a wedding text, I think that's lovely. And then also we have an Aramaic poem where a very similar structure, but it's a lament for the 9th of Av, and it embeds Lamentations 1. So I say here, to participate in even a common acclamation required no great expertise or any substantial preparation. These rhythms and formulas were already familiar to everyone in the empire, whether from theater songs or popular songs that derived from them, or from participation in previous acclamations. This idea that people would have simply by living their daily lives, participating in popular entertainments of the day, would have sort of found this to be an unsurprising element of synagogue ritual as well. So as I say here, they would be a typical and even expected element of speech. Liturgical poetry constituted a form of public speech. And I say it's sort of an affirmation of authority, communal assertion, and collective identity. And it was a synergy not only between poets and homilists and public speakers, but also in terms of religious and civic spaces. This would have been important for the poets. There would have been reasons why poets and liturgists would have found this an appealing way of keeping their ritual practices up to date. So biblical stories are embellished. The listeners become part of the tale, and they sort of even function as like an informal chorus. The congregation gets to sort of relive, as it were, parts of the biblical tradition. This is something that's certainly very solemnly understood in terms of the Eucharist. It's also an important part of other non-poetic rituals like the Torah service and the Passover Seder, but it lets people sort of like see themselves in the moment. And they energize a given moment, much the way non-Jewish acclamations do. I say sort of what we see for the listeners, they get to be normal, but also Jewish. So group speech is different from individual speech. It reinforces a sense of community. It gives voice to power and lends weight to petitionary speech. So it's one thing to say, I want something. It's another thing to have you and 180 of your closest friends want something. It expresses communal wish. Bless the groom, restore the temple, and it knits the community together through that experience. I think anyone who in the last 4 years attended a protest or anything, sort of that sense of having been together with people shouting at an airport can be memorable. That was my Facebook memory from today. So in terms of acclamation revisited, I just sort of want to stress that part of what's important is that I'm in a field where most of what I have to work with are texts, sort of the actual liturgical poems. I have written texts. And in some ways, those are the most remote part of the actual experience of the ancient synagogue. As I say, they are an echo of experience captured in script. They're sort of the baseline. We wouldn't have liturgical poems without these texts. But in terms of what actually happened in the synagogue, it was not as if people were standing in pews holding hymnals. This was a much more dynamic and auditory and visual kind of experience. And as Susan Ashbrook Harvey writes, it's important for scholars to remember how much religious activity took place outdoors, in public, in accessible spaces, as processions through the city's streets or in marketplaces, and that late antiquity was noisy. In sort of closing, as I sort of wind this up, one of the things I want to talk about is the fact that even in antiquity, there was a question of where did this sort of like sudden flourishing of hymnody, and even the sort of custom of dynamic intercourse sort of like come from? There's, which maybe it reflects an idea, sort of a new recognition of its prominence, because as we can see, it's actually, quite, in a lot of ways, it's quite old. But I think, in terms of where did this liturgical poetry come, it's intriguing to me that Latin writers considered the acclamations, especially in a liturgical setting, to be an exotic import. So Augustine described the innovative singing of hymns and psalms as being in the Eastern style. And Paulinus expands on it and say the Eastern mode refers to the singing of antiphons, hymns, and vigils, which is precisely the kind of acclamatory poetry that was emerging in the Eastern Mediterranean and Mesopotamia in the 4th century in the Christian context. So we have sort of this idea that, so on the one hand, I look at it and I say, oh, it seems to reflect the Jewish synthesis of things that were going on in the Greco-Roman world. At the same time, we have Latin writers thinking that maybe they got it from the East. So we have sort of these short hymnic acclamations represent an adaptation of something very Eastern, biblical or Jewish to a Roman and eventually Christian style public experience, but also something Roman to an Eastern liturgical sphere, sort of this translation or flowing back and forth from East to West, a translation not of words and ideas, but even of sound. And part I say here, all artists are thieves, to which I credit Beth Holmgren, a previous TGI, FHI speaker and friend of mine. Is always like to say that because in the end, these liturgical poets were artists, and if they could sense a way of communicating effectively with their audiences and achieving the effect they sought, in the same way that orators might trash talk actors, but they still studied them, I think you can imagine that liturgical poets, just in the same way that we know that homilists as well, preachers studied sort of effective speech and attempt to borrow what was effective and then discard what they saw as inappropriate. So we have here, and just sort of to finish up, I just want to sort of talk about the fact that acclamations are one part of what I study in my current project. Like I say, I'm interested in reading these works comparatively, because we see very similar techniques being used in Greek, Syriac, Samaritan poetry. I'm very interested in architecture, sort of the way that sort of even lines of sight and acoustics can shape the experience. These works, how are they seen? How important was sight, especially if I think about gesture and delivery, as well as insight from the material artifacts. But also as a text person, I really love pictures, as you can see here, and also just other elements of delivery. And so what I think of, to use Catherine Reckless's term, the kinesthetic imagination. So the way that sort of even the physical experience, it's one thing to read words silently to yourself in the solitude of your bedroom. It's another thing to read them in sort of a noisy house, as many of us are now. But it's entirely different to experience them in a setting with many other voices alongside your own. And I would mention that I'm always sort of, I think in terms of character and other things, it's important about that we all are always, that every text has an audience. Even when we're reading works by ourselves, we often, I think, we don't realize until we see the movie adaptation or something, that we had actually a very firm picture of what things look like, because whatever we were thinking is not that the director put up on the screen. We kind of find ourselves sort of like having cognitive dissonance between the way we imagined something being and when it's brought to life. And so to close out sort of this idea sort of the intersection of religious voices in public spaces, I have here just some evocative images of Martin Luther King, Heschel, and Rabbi Eisendrath, sort of protests of religious protest, religious speech in the streets. Then we have civic, we have Les Duncan, who's a preacher in the state of Washington, who is bringing sort of the body language, as it were, of civic protest into the sanctuary. And then, just because I love medieval illuminations, a Muslim and a Christian playing the lute together in a medieval manuscript. So that's all, folks. So, and there's words being made manifest in a little shofar there.